In the frozen winter of 1947, a county health inspector pushed open the rotting door of a Kentucky cabin. What he saw inside wasn't just hardship. It was a nightmare of bloodlines twisted beyond recognition. 3 generations of men crammed under one roof. Brothers bound to brothers, cousins fathering children with cousins, and at the core, 2 brothers who had forged an oath that would scar their descendants forever. The inspector's report was locked away for decades, too disturbing for the public eye. But the truth didn't vanish. Records, certificates, and autopsies reveal a male bloodline that turned into a living case study of what happens when boundaries collapse and kinship consumes itself. This isn't myth. These were real men, real choices, real consequences etched into flesh and bone. And their legacy still lingers, haunting the land they once called home. If stories like this grip you, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who thinks they've seen everything. Trust me, they haven't. In the spring of 1923, 2 brothers stood together on a Kentucky hillside, staring at a weather-beaten cabin that would soon define their destiny. That day, they forged a pact no outsider could understand. The elder brother, scarred by years of coal mining, carried the weight of their family's survival. The younger, fragile in spirit, clung to him desperately, terrified that life might tear them apart forever. Their father had been crushed in a mining collapse, leaving them alone in a world that offered no kindness. From that moment, the brothers promised each other they would never be separated. But promises can twist into chains. When the elder sought to build a household, the younger grew desperate. He swore he would end his own life rather than lose the only bond he cherished. Cornered between loyalty and freedom, the elder made a vow. They would share everything, not just shelter or food, but blood, descendants, and names. In that moment, their fates became inseparably entangled. By the winter of 1924, official records reveal both brothers had fathered sons. The children were registered under the elder's name, though both men raised them equally, blurring lines between father, uncle, and brother. What no outsider understood was that these men were not just brothers. They were distant cousins. Their shared blood already narrowed the genetic pool. Their pact would only concentrate that lineage until it fractured under its own weight. The cabin became their fortress and prison. Surrounded by dense Appalachian forest, they lived 15 miles from the nearest town. Neighbors whispered, but silence kept the brothers' truth hidden from curious eyes. At first, their sons seemed healthy. Dark-haired, sturdy, and spirited, they played in the dirt outside the cabin, unaware that their very existence carried the seeds of future suffering. The men convinced themselves all was well. By 1930, the cabin echoed with 8 boys. 4 claimed by the elder, 4 by the younger, though every child bore the stamp of the same patriarchal blood. They called both men father, knowing no difference. As the boys grew, shadows crept into their bodies. The eldest son began seizing violently at 12. His spine curved, his growth stunted, and his voice cracked with suffering no doctor could explain. The second son, born only months later, carried even greater burdens. His skull was malformed, his hearing absent, his features unsettling. Neighbors recoiled, and the brothers kept him hidden within the cabin's walls. Yet the men refused to see the truth. They told themselves misfortune came from cursed land, poisoned water, or divine punishment. Never once did they accept that their pact had sown the damage within. By 1940, horror deepened. The eldest son, broken in body yet still alive, fathered a child with his own half-brother's son. The infant emerged barely human, lungs incomplete, organs twisted, brain unformed. It survived 3 months. The county coroner, a stern man named Dr. William Patterson, recorded in his private notes, "This is the most genetically damaged boy I have ever seen in 30 years. His words would haunt him forever." But instead of ending the cycle, the brothers pressed further. They convinced their surviving sons that purity required them to remain within the bloodline. Cousin with cousin, brother with brother, the pact consumed itself. Each new generation brought fresh suffering. Boys who could not walk, could not speak, whose limbs curled inwards like branches burned by fire. The cabin was no longer a home, but a shrine to collapse. And so, what began as a promise of loyalty between two men twisted into a legacy of destruction. The brothers' pact had created not strength, but a crumbling bloodline destined to echo as warning for centuries. The cabin stood like a scar on the Kentucky hillside, its timbers darkened by decades of coal smoke and rain. For outsiders, it looked abandoned. For the brothers and their sons, it was everything. Inside, the air was thick with damp wood and the smell of burning coal. 17 men shared 4 cramped rooms. They slept on straw mats, shoulder to shoulder, pressed together like prisoners of their own blood. The brothers enforced silence when outsiders approached. If a hunter or traveling preacher passed nearby, the sons were ordered indoors. Curtains of burlap covered the windows. To neighbors, the place seemed cursed, avoided by all. Yet within, a strange order prevailed. The elder brother held authority, his word binding as law. The younger, though equal in fatherhood, deferred to him. Their sons addressed them both as father, blurring every boundary. For the boys, there was no normal childhood. They hunted rabbits, chopped firewood, and tilled rocky soil. Their games were brutal contests of strength, often ending in blood, but praised as proof of resilience. Some of the younger sons grew restless, asking about towns beyond the mountains. The brothers silenced them with fear. They warned of hostile men outside who would destroy them for keeping their bloodline pure. This doctrine became gospel. The sons grew up believing they were chosen, set apart from outsiders. Their deformities were framed not as curses, but signs of divine trial, proof that they alone carried sacred strength. But faith cracked under reality. One boy, barely 12, collapsed while hauling firewood, his chest convulsing. His brothers carried him inside, but he died before dawn. The elder brother blamed demons, not their pact. Each death drove the men deeper into isolation. The cabin grew heavier with grief, yet no one dared question their oath. The brothers insisted the line must continue, no matter the cost in flesh and blood. By 1935, churchmen whispered of strange noises in the woods. They said chants echoed from the hills, the voices of men praying in a language no one recognized. Fear spread, and locals avoided the area entirely. The county coroner, Dr. Patterson, made occasional visits when summoned. Each time he returned shaken, unable to comprehend the boys' twisted bodies. His private notes described a living laboratory of genetic collapse, hidden in plain sight. Yet nothing changed. The brothers barred all intervention, claiming outsiders could never understand. They raised their sons to mistrust every sheriff, every doctor, every preacher. Isolation became not just survival, but a religion of secrecy. In winter, hunger gnawed at them. The men set traps in the frozen forest, catching whatever moved. The weakest boys were often left behind, unable to keep pace. Their brothers carried guilt, but never spoke it aloud. The cabin walls absorbed their suffering. Blood from seizures stained straw mats. Cries of boys born broken echoed until their voices fell silent. Still, the brothers clung to their pact, unwilling to see the destruction they'd wrought. To them, this wasn't tragedy. It was destiny. They believed the world outside was corrupt, while their enclosed brotherhood carried purity. Each deformity was a test, each death a sacrifice proving their chosen status. By 1940, the cabin had become myth among locals. Hunters swore they saw malformed boys in the woods at dusk, watching silently before vanishing into trees. No one approached after dark. The place was cursed. Yet for those inside, it was simply home. A fortress of shadows where men were born, lived, and died, never knowing another world. The brothers' pact had built more than a household. It had built a prison. And within those walls, the cycle of suffering tightened its grip, preparing horrors even the brothers themselves could no longer control. The cabin waited, silent, while the bloodline twisted further toward ruin. By the early 1930s, the cabin pulsed with the energy of growing boys. 8 sons, born within a handful of years, filled the rooms with shouts, coughs, and cries that echoed endlessly through the valley. These sons were both cousins and brothers, though no distinction existed inside those walls. Each called the elder and younger patriarch father, their loyalties divided yet unified beneath the shadow of the pact. As the boys aged, cracks emerged. The eldest staggered with seizures that twisted his body. His limbs shook violently, his words slurred. Yet the patriarchs insisted he was strong, chosen, forged by divine struggle. Another son's skull grew misshapen as bone plates fused incorrectly. His eyes sat too far apart, his hearing absent. Outsiders would have labeled him cursed, but inside the cabin, he was told he was sacred. The sons carried contradictions, praised for their suffering, shamed for their weakness, demanded to be both warriors and martyrs. Their days blended into labor, their nights into whispered prayers that bound them deeper to the pact. Doctors could not reach them. The patriarchs shielded their sons from hospitals, believing medicine corrupted divine purity. Records that survived were smuggled notes from Coroner Patterson, who described bodies betraying themselves before reaching manhood. Yet the boys endured. They hunted rabbits, hauled wood, and tilled rocky soil until their hands blistered. Strength became proof of worth. Weakness brought lectures from both patriarchs about loyalty, sacrifice, and blood untainted by outsiders. By adolescence, the doctrine of purity controlled their minds. The patriarchs convinced them that outside men were enemies, plotting to destroy their sacred brotherhood. The sons grew distrustful, suspicious of every sound beyond the tree line. But distrust could not erase curiosity. One bold son asked about schools, towns, and other boys beyond the hills. His question earned a beating from both patriarchs and weeks of silence from his brothers. The message was clear. Loyalty meant silence. Any desire for the outside world was treachery. The pact mattered more than freedom, more than health, more than the lives already lost to deformity. Inevitably, bonds between brothers deepened beyond normal kinship. The patriarchs encouraged it, telling their sons that continuing the line required them to remain with one another. Cousins became partners, nephews became heirs. The cycle turned inward. By 1940, the first child of this second generation was born, the grandson of both patriarchs, yet also their nephew. He entered life frail, gasping, with organs misaligned. He survived only 3 months. Dr. Patterson's notes describe him as the most genetically damaged boy I have encountered, yet even his death was framed by the patriarchs as a trial ordained by God. No lesson was learned, no cycle broken. The sons, still young men, accepted their father's explanations. They mourned, but believed suffering made them special. Each death hardened them, convincing them they were chosen to endure pain no outsider could comprehend. One son grew violent, lashing out against brothers during disputes. Another retreated inward, speaking rarely, his mind clouded. A third collapsed into seizures so severe he was carried by others to avoid choking on his tongue. Despite this suffering, the patriarchs demanded new sons be born. They drew crude charts on paper scraps, mapping which cousins should join, which brothers should continue. The pact evolved into strategy, a blueprint of collapse. The cabin became both nursery and graveyard. Sons were born broken, lived briefly, and died within the same 4 rooms. Yet every death was recorded, every name added to charts as though the bloodline was sacred scripture. The sons of the pact carried burdens heavier than their own frail bodies. They were both victims and believers, bound by loyalty to patriarchs who had mistaken fear for destiny and turned kinship into destruction. By the dawn of the 1940s, the pact had entered its darkest phase. The sons, once merely children of the patriarchs, were now grown men commanded to bind themselves further within the collapsing bloodline. The patriarchs preached that true loyalty meant remaining with brothers. To seek bonds outside would invite corruption. They insisted that purity came only from within, no outsiders allowed. Every boy absorbed this teaching as gospel. One by one, cousins became partners, sons pledged to sons, nephews became heirs. No separation existed between kinship and lineage. The pact had swallowed every natural boundary, leaving only the command to multiply within itself. The first unions of this second generation brought sons into the cabin. Fragile, malformed, often blind or mute, they were cradled by men who believed their weakness proved divine favor. Survival itself became an impossible trial. Dr. Patterson, still recording in secret, described the newborns as human experiments of fate. His notes revealed twisted spines, missing limbs, organs positioned wrong. Yet somehow, some survived long enough to deepen the lineage's collapse. One boy, born without sight, shuffled through the cabin guided by older brothers. Another never spoke, only screamed, his voice echoing off wooden walls. Their existence bound the men further to the belief in chosen suffering. Still, the patriarchs encouraged more. They claimed each broken child was proof they were tested by higher powers. Instead of seeing warning signs, they saw validation. Their doctrine grew stronger with every malformed birth. The sons obeyed. They were taught that questioning the pact meant betraying their fathers. To resist meant exile, death, or worse, losing the bond of brotherhood that defined their very identities. Outside, whispers grew louder. Hunters claimed to see disfigured boys watching from tree lines. Miners spoke of voices chanting in the night, yet no one dared interfere, fearing both superstition and the wrath of the patriarchs. Inside the cabin, the men lived as if in another world. They invented their own language, a mix of broken English and private codes. Outsiders would never understand. The pact had become its own culture. By 1942, 3 new sons had been born within these unions. One lived without walking, his legs twisted. Another survived but never learned to feed himself. The third clung to life for 2 agonizing years. Every breath was suffering, yet the patriarchs clapped their hands and declared these boys blessed. Their endurance was framed as divine will, not genetic consequence. The cycle grew deeper with every broken body. One elder son, unable to endure, drowned himself in the river that cut the valley. His body was pulled to shore by brothers who wept but said nothing, fearing the patriarch's wrath more than grief. The deaths multiplied, sons collapsed from seizures, infants suffocated in their sleep. Still, the brothers obeyed. Still, the line continued. The pact had become greater than survival. It was a god of its own making. Patterson's despair deepened. He wrote that the cabin had become a shrine to human ruin, yet he lacked the authority to intervene. Each visit left him hollow, unable to reconcile duty with horror. Meanwhile, the patriarchs tightened control. They promised the line would outlast outsiders, that suffering was the path to strength. Their sons, conditioned from birth, could not imagine another life beyond that doctrine. By the mid-1940s, the bloodline had collapsed into itself. The brothers had fulfilled their vow. No outsiders had touched their lineage. Yet what remained was not purity, but devastation carried in the veins of every son. And still, the cabin stood, filled with broken bodies, fervent prayers, and the echo of loyalty twisted into ruin. The pact had become prophecy, and prophecy had become destruction, sealed forever among brothers. In the frozen winter of 1947, County Health Inspector Robert Mills trudged through knee-deep snow toward the remote cabin. He expected to investigate neglect. What he discovered instead would scar his mind until death. The moment he opened the warped door, The stench hit him, unwashed bodies, rotting wood, sickness lingering in the air. Inside, 17 men lived crammed together, trapped in shadows that seemed older than time. Mills recorded every detail. The cabin's 4 rooms held straw mats, soaked with sweat and blood. Broken furniture leaned against sagging walls. Fires smoldered in barrels, filling the air with smoke that burned his eyes. But worse than the environment were the men themselves. Sons shuffled with twisted limbs, spines curved like bows. Some stared blankly, unable to speak. Others convulsed in seizures as if their own bodies waged war against them. One boy, no older than 10, dragged himself across the floor using only his arms. Another sat rocking, unable to form words. Several older brothers watched silently, as though this suffering was ordinary. Mills asked questions. The patriarchs answered with conviction. They insisted their bloodline was chosen, sacred, untouchable by outsiders. They claimed their deformities were divine tests, signs of strength, proof that only their pact carried truth. The inspector scribbled furiously, unable to believe what he heard. Never in training had he been prepared for a family who believed suffering itself was a blessing. It was delusion hardened into religion. He counted the boys. 11 survived, though most bore visible damage. Some could not walk, others could not hear, and several lacked even the ability to feed themselves. Yet the patriarchs defended their choices fiercely. One patriarch told him, "These sons are proof of purity. Outsiders will never understand. Our blood is clean, our oath eternal." His eyes burned with conviction Mills found more terrifying than any deformity. The inspector noticed charts pinned to the walls, crude diagrams of lineage, names written and crossed out, arrows pointing from brother to cousin. It was a breeding map, a plan for generations still unborn. Mills felt his stomach turn. This was no accident of isolation. It was intentional. A deliberate system to keep the bloodline closed, even as each generation collapsed further under the weight of its own code. When he stepped outside, icy wind cut his face. But it couldn't wash away what he had seen. Behind him, the cabin loomed like a tomb, filled with living evidence of genetic devastation. That night, Mills wrote his official report. His words described not neglect, but a living laboratory of collapse. He knew officials would hesitate, fearing scandal. Still, he resolved that silence could not continue. For days, he wrestled with his conscience. Intervention might save some boys, yet it would also expose them to a world unprepared to witness such ruin. The weight of that choice nearly broke him. Eventually, Mills delivered the report to the courthouse. He demanded action. He argued the bloodline must be stopped before more sons were born into agony. His courage set into motion events that could not be reversed. The patriarchs, however, would not surrender easily. Word of Mills's intentions spread. Inside the cabin, preparations began. Weapons cleaned, doors reinforced, sons instructed to resist outsiders who threatened their way of life. The stage was set for confrontation. What Mills uncovered was no longer hidden. The cabin's secret had been pulled into light, and the bloodline's fate now hung between loyalty, violence, and the possibility of escape. And as the snow deepened across Kentucky hills, the inspector understood. What waited inside that cabin was not just a tragedy of blood, but a battle between truth and delusion that would decide the line's end. By 1947, the bloodline had reached its breaking point. The patriarchs still spoke of purity, but their sons' bodies told another story. Bones bent unnaturally, minds faltered, and lives withered before reaching adulthood. Inside the cabin, suffering became routine. Seizures rattled the walls at night, gasps of boys struggling to breathe echoed through the halls, and groans of pain blended with prayers whispered by devoted fathers and brothers. One boy, barely a teenager, never grew beyond the size of a child. His mind remained infant-like, his voice limited to cries. His brothers carried him everywhere, yet the patriarchs praised his endurance as divine. Another, older son lost the ability to walk entirely. His legs curled beneath him, leaving him bound to the floor. Yet he was still expected to contribute, dragged to chores by stronger brothers each morning. The youngest of the brood entered life gasping. Born with twisted organs, his skin pale, he clung to existence for 2 short years. Every breath was agony, but his death brought no reconsideration of the pact. The patriarchs hardened further. They taught that these losses were proof outsiders would never understand their sacred oath. Each deformity, each death, was framed as a trial only their bloodline was destined to endure. Dr. Patterson, summoned yet again, wrote despairingly in his notes, "I am watching men die before manhood, and still their fathers celebrate collapse as faith." He left the cabin haunted, unable to speak publicly. By this time, even some sons began questioning. Whispers rose in corners. Why must they suffer? Why must they remain? But open doubt brought swift punishment. Loyalty to the pact was enforced with fear. The inspector's report circulated quietly through officials. Arguments raged. Was it mercy to intervene, or cruelty to expose the sons to a world that would brand them monsters? The debate stalled, while the boys decayed further. Inside, hunger worsened. Winter cut deep, and weak sons collapsed carrying wood. Their bodies were left on straw mats, given simple burials in shallow earth. The patriarchs told survivors these deaths were offerings to God. One son attempted escape. He reached the edge of the valley before collapsing from seizures. Dragged back by brothers, he was beaten until unconscious, his rebellion crushed beneath the same doctrine that destroyed them all. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical. The sons' laughter faded. They invented private words only they understood, retreating into a language no outsider could decipher, shielding their pain from the world. By 1947, records show 11 still lived. Only 3 displayed enough strength to function independently. The rest required constant care, unable to speak, walk, or even feed themselves without the help of stronger brothers. The patriarchs ignored reality. They scribbled new charts, planning unions for the next generation. Their obsession with purity blinded them, convincing them the line must continue even as collapse swallowed every living son. Patterson confessed privately he no longer believed medicine could help. "These men are not simply patients," he wrote. "They are monuments to loyalty twisted into ruin." His despair drove him to abandon medicine altogether. Meanwhile, Mills pressed authorities. He insisted action was urgent, yet every day of delay meant another death. The county feared scandal, the church feared outrage, but the inspector could not quiet his conscience. Collapse was no longer theoretical. It was real, present, undeniable. The sons of the pact had become shadows, living evidence of what happens when loyalty defies nature. Their bodies told a story no words could soften, and yet, inside the cabin, the patriarchs still whispered prayers, convinced their brotherhood was eternal, blind to the fact that collapse was already complete. The bloodline was dying, even as they declared it pure. In March of 1947, county officials finally acted. Armed with Mills's detailed report, state authorities moved toward the isolated valley. Their goal was simple: rescue the surviving sons and end the brothers' collapsing bloodline forever. But the patriarchs had prepared. Word of outsiders spread quickly, and the cabin was fortified. Doors were reinforced with timber, windows blocked with boards, and shotguns leaned against walls. Resistance was inevitable, surrender unthinkable. The sons, conditioned since birth, obeyed their fathers. Even the weakest stood at windows, clutching sticks or rusted tools, ready to defend the pact. Fear of outsiders outweighed fear of death itself. When officials arrived, they found the cabin barricaded. The patriarchs shouted from within, declaring that government men sought to destroy God's chosen bloodline. Their voices were ragged, filled with conviction that bordered on madness. Negotiations began, but each word hardened resistance. The patriarchs screamed that no son would be taken, that purity must remain untouched. They spoke of divine commands, dismissing every plea for mercy as deceit. The standoff dragged for 3 days. Inside, tension grew unbearable. Food dwindled, fires smoked, and sons coughed violently in the thick air. Still, none dared defy the patriarchs. Loyalty to the pact outweighed survival. Tragedy struck as 2 frail boys collapsed during the siege. Their weakened bodies could not withstand stress. Both died before dawn, their corpses hidden from officials outside. Even in death, secrecy was preserved. Mills watched from the perimeter, his heart heavy. He had triggered this confrontation, yet each passing hour proved the cost unbearable. He wondered whether intervention would save lives or simply accelerate their destruction. On the 3rd night, officials forced entry. The cabin door splintered under axes. Inside, chaos erupted. Sons screamed, patriarchs brandished weapons, and officials stormed through smoke-filled rooms thick with the stench of decay. One patriarch fired a shotgun, striking the ceiling. Officials restrained him as sons wailed. The other patriarch clung to charts of lineage, begging them not to burn the only records of their so-called sacred line. The sight inside horrified rescuers. Boys unable to stand crawled across the floor. Others cowered in corners, shielding themselves from light they had never seen. Some stared blankly, uncomprehending of the world invading their home. Officials carried survivors outside, blinking in sunlight for the first time. Their frail bodies trembled, lungs gasped, and minds reeled. The world they entered was alien, vast, and terrifying after years in confinement. The patriarchs were dragged out last, still shouting warnings of divine vengeance. Their resistance had failed, but their conviction remained. They insisted their bloodline had been chosen, even as collapse consumed every surviving son. Medical specialists from the University of Kentucky arrived to evaluate survivors. Their findings were devastating. Of 11 sons, only 3 possessed potential for independent life. The rest required lifelong care, bound by severe disabilities. The charts recovered from the cabin revealed chilling plans. Future unions had already been mapped, brothers paired with cousins, nephews bound to uncles, a blueprint of suffering intended to extend for generations. The state could not allow it to continue. The patriarchs were committed to institutions, their weapons seized, their cabin abandoned. The bloodline experiment, after 3 decades, had finally met a wall stronger than their oath. For the officials, the rescue was victory. For the sons, it was bewilderment, terror, and dislocation. They had known only the cabin, only the pact, and now faced a world both freer and crueler. The intervention ended the line, but the cost was irreversible. Dozens of sons had lived and died in agony. The brothers' oath, born of fear and loyalty, had become resistance so fierce it devoured its own children. When the cabin finally fell silent, it was reclaimed by wilderness. Vines crawled across collapsed timbers, weeds overtook stone foundations, and the voices of generations of men were swallowed by the indifferent Kentucky hills. But records endured. Mills' report, Patterson's private notes, and state archives preserved the horrors in ink and paper. What the patriarchs believed sacred became a medical case study, taught in universities for decades to come. Researchers described the line as a laboratory of collapse. Sons had been born broken, lived brief lives of torment, and died in obscurity. Their existence became evidence of what unchecked isolation and loyalty can destroy. Mills never escaped what he witnessed. Haunted by memories of twisted bodies and hollow stares, he required psychiatric treatment later in life. He told colleagues no man should have seen what he had endured. Dr. Patterson abandoned medicine entirely. Once a respected coroner, he fled to California, became a carpenter, and refused ever again to study another body. The bloodline had broken more than sons. It had broken him. the surviving sons faced brutal futures. Of 3 deemed capable of independence, 2 died before adulthood, one from seizures, another from organ failure. The last lived longer, yet carried fear of his blood until death. This survivor, given a new identity, never married, never fathered sons. He confessed privately he feared passing on the damage etched into his DNA. His life became testimony to the inescapable weight of inheritance. Meanwhile, the abandoned cabin decayed. Locals avoided the site, whispering that strange shapes still wandered the woods. Hunters spoke of distant cries at night. No one camped there. The land itself carried the curse of memory. Historians later argued the patriarchs were not monsters but men ruled by fear. Afraid of loneliness, afraid of outsiders, they built a prison of loyalty so rigid it consumed every descendant born to their line. Their pact began as devotion, a promise of unity after their father's death. But devotion twisted into dogma, dogma hardened into doctrine, and doctrine became ruin. What they believed eternal became their undoing. Today, rusted tools and broken bottles still surface in the dirt where the cabin once stood. Each artifact is a silent relic of men who tried to outwit isolation and instead created devastation. Medical schools continue to reference the case. Genetic counselors cite it as warning. When kinship folds into itself, collapse is inevitable. The Whitlock brothers' oath became one of the most infamous examples in American records. Yet the most haunting lesson is not genetic, but human. It is how fear, when left unchecked, can twist into ideology. How love between brothers, meant to protect, can become the spark that destroys. The patriarchs did not intend cruelty. They intended loyalty. They intended unity. But intention did not matter. Their choices carved suffering into flesh and bone, leaving scars not only on sons but on history itself. The valley remembers in silence. Trees grow where boys once played. Rivers flow where bodies once were buried. Nature reclaims, but the story lingers, whispered by those brave enough to speak it aloud. For every broken body, every wasted life, every name crossed out on those crude lineage charts, the legacy remains, proof that no oath, however sacred, can defy the laws that govern blood and survival. The Brotherhood's line ended not with triumph, but with silence. Their names erased, their blood scattered, their doctrine dissolved. What remains is warning, carved not in stone, but in the memory of men. And so, the cabin of the brothers stands in history as both lesson and curse, proof that loyalty without wisdom can destroy, and that even the strongest bonds, when twisted, can become the most devastating chains. In the end, such stories remind us that when families cross the natural limits of relationships, it leads only to pain, suffering, and broken generations. Every human being is honored with dignity, and protecting that dignity means respecting the boundaries set for us. From this we learn. When we protect family ties in the right way, society stays healthy, pure, and strong. Let us take this as a reminder, not to repeat the mistakes of the past, but to walk with wisdom and care for the future.